them. So essentially what happens is for individuals who are very new to running, who have a low training age, because they don't have their aerobic base, as soon as they start an easy jog or any type of run that's above walking, their heart rate will elevate and they essentially can't stay in that true zone 2 heart rate. And that's okay for a lot of them because to get that aerobic base, it's just about consistent training over time based on what I've seen in my experience. And a lot of times that zone 2 will develop over time.
Right, Jonah, welcome to the channel.
Hey, thank you for having me.
You're a applied sports scientist, right? So, could you, I mean, probably the audience doesn't really know your full background. So, could you maybe introduce yourself quickly, what your background is, and how did you get into sports science, and why are you interested in sports science?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So yeah, my background, kind of like you mentioned, is in applied sports science. Just finished up about 8 to 10 years working in American team sports. So mostly things like American football, basketball, American soccer, European football, as they say.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
essentially, my main job there was to utilize technology to monitor the players, but also then prescribe specific exercise interventions, just to really optimize whether it was their strength, conditioning, things along those lines. So using biomechanical testing or things like force plates alongside metabolic testing as well, and just monitoring the players over time through like GPS and other forms of testing. Before that, I was actually fortunate enough to study under Dr. Coyle, and so that lab at University of Texas Austin, where I was a lot on like substrate oxidation, specifically endurance athletes, a lot on cycling is what Dr. Coyle did. So that was a really great experience. So I was super fortunate through all those experiences to get just different areas of expertise and strength training, for example, for performance, but then also a lot on the metabolic side and nutritional side as well when I was studying at the Dr. Coyle. And now what I do is I have my own business in New York City where we actually focus a lot on runners and running performance. And just based on my background, where a lot of what I did before was utilizing things like metabolism. So just how we optimize run training through just overall training interventions, but then also support on the nutritional side, fueling for some of these endurance athletes and strength training as well. And then a lot of it too still is utilizing technology to monitor their training and provide feedback based on that.
Yeah, really interesting. I will definitely link some of the work of Dr. Coyle in the description of this video because I think it's very useful for people to read some of his work. Very elegant, very elegant work, I would say. Cool. So, I mean, I caught like an interesting post caught my eye you made some time ago about zone two. Like
Yeah.
within the endurance world, it's obviously a very known concept. It's basically low intensity running, cycling, biking, whatever. And you said that for many, let's say, novice athletes, um, getting into the zone two is basically impossible because they are not really
Yeah.
aerobically well equipped and they're almost immediately in zone three or some zone above. And many of the audience or the people listening to this podcast or watching this podcast are coming from the CrossFit background, also some HYROX athletes now. So it applies very well to them. I think I've tested a lot of CrossFit athletes and zone two is
Yeah.
kind of inexistent. So could you maybe elaborate on this, maybe on your own experiences on this post and on this ID?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Yeah, I've done a lot of metabolic testing on different individuals with different experiences regarding to how much endurance training they have or how long they've been running or different types of athletes. And you brought up a great point. So the inspiration for this post was I've noticed two key trends from my metabolic testing and then working with athletes trying to train zone two after. Number one, when an individual first starts endurance training, they often will have a very hard time doing a true zone two. And you can probably speak to this as well too. And a lot of that is just because they don't actually have that underlying aerobic fitness to really do zone two. Like if you think about what really leads to zone two from a physiological definition, it's probably pretty stable levels of lactate, and we can essentially clear the lactate just as much as it's being produced, or however you want to say that. So essentially, there's very low carbohydrate oxidation. You're probably utilizing mostly fat as fuel and some of these other substrate, just from a substrate standpoint. But what we see is for that to happen is someone needs an underlying level of aerobic fitness. For individuals who haven't really developed that yet or who are very new to training, essentially what happens as soon as they get above a walking effort, that's a bit of intensity for them because their body just hasn't developed the underlying physiological adaptations, such as like increased capillaries, some of the cardiovascular adaptations, and mitochondrial adaptations, which allows them to stay in that zone too. And so essentially what happens is as soon as they start exercising at any intensity, they just start getting producing some lactate or obviously like utilizing the carbohydrates anaerobically for a fuel source, just because they don't have that underlying aerobic base to for that exercise intensity to be easy enough for them to rely mostly on like fat oxidation or some of these other aerobic metabolism. So essentially what happens is for individuals who are very new to running, who have a low training age, because they don't have the aerobic base, as soon as they start an easy jog or any type of run that's above walking, their heart rate will elevate and they essentially can't stay in that true zone two heart rate. And that's okay for a lot of them because to get that aerobic base, it's just about consistent training over time based on what I've seen in my experience. And a lot of times that zone two will develop over time. And I'm actually curious based on your experience because you would have more knowledge than me about this. I have seen this too in CrossFitters as well, or other very high intensity
Hmm.
athletes is what I would say. So when
Yeah.
I work with like team sport athletes who actually haven't done a ton of like low aerobic work or who mostly just do like high intensity interval training, we see this as well too. And I don't know if it's because of like a phenotype, like mostly fast twitch dominant or some type of phenotype, where they essentially don't have that aerobic base or those physiological adaptations, like as the mitochondria develop capillaries. But what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I see almost exactly the same. I think it's still fascinating, right? Like one of the things that got me interested in CrossFit per se is obviously like the variety of the sport. And it's kind of a completely unconventional way of training. There's no aerobic training almost, right?
Yeah,
Like intensity is the friend. You always go hard. And when you see those athletes, just see them and see them working out, you think, okay, they must be quite well equipped aerobically, because they can generate a lot of power in a pretty short time
yep,
frame, but not like 2 minutes. Also, 20-minute workout, 15-minute workout,
yeah,
which inevitably will be highly aerobic. They can produce enormous amounts of energy. But when you test them, like with a lactate curve, I think that's the best, like a lactate measurements, they
yeah,
have most of them, I mean, even the elite games athletes have a very mediocre aerobic base and they go into this yellow zone, middle zone, zone 3 to 4 almost immediately.
yeah,
But still, they can work there very long, and then they end up with a lactate of 20 or 22 millimolars, like crazy in
yeah,
endurance, like an endurance test, right? So it's always a bit of a question, like, okay, is this a problem? Does this hamper their long-term fitness, or is this just maybe good because there is always going to be a blend of and anaerobic energy sources, and for that specific sport, that's, let's say, optimal, right?
yeah,
Um, I don't. At this moment, I still don't know the answer. It would be interesting to have some kind of a case study where you take a young athlete interested in doing CrossFit, and from his 14, 15-year-old, you let him do much more aerobic work, like on the ergs, even running and so on for multiple hours per week, and see if they can actually get further, right? Like get further in sport than just getting this ceiling, because of the always high intensity efforts. I don't know. The only thing I can tell you is that we tested elite CrossFit Games athletes on, like, we've profiled them physiologically, VO2 max mostly in those kind of energy systems, and what we found is that their VO2 max is actually pretty mediocre, right? Like we're talking about 55 to 60.
yeah,
And also even, okay, they're big athletes, so that's the relative base will not be that high, but also absolutely, they don't have that massive VO2 maxes compared to, for example, a cross-country skier or whatever, right? Like a cyclist or something. So I do think it has something to do with the mitochondrial content, with the long-term aerobic development that they just didn't do, like simply didn't do. And
yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting thought process, and we don't know. Like we really don't know. So yeah,
Yeah. No, I agree. I think you brought up a great point. Something that I come back to a lot is I feel like the body tends to adapt in the most optimal way to whatever the specific demands are.
yeah,
So if you have a CrossFit athlete who, yeah, does perform higher intensity, whether those efforts are 2 to 20 minutes, for
yeah,
example, kind of like you said, like they often will probably be a mix of like aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, but their ability to utilize a carbohydrate dominant strategy or like be a little anaerobic or like utilize a lot of carbs for energy for their events is probably beneficial because
yeah,
it's going to be the most efficient energy source for them at those intensities. So
yeah,
maybe their bodies have just adapted over time to preferentially like burn carbohydrates at a higher rate and be a little more have accumulate a little more lactate. And that may not
yeah.
be a bad thing.
Yeah.
But again, I don't know either.
Yeah. I definitely, I mean, what you just said is for sure happening, right? But the question is, yeah, for real long-term development and to break through that ceiling for most athletes,
Yeah,
it might still be a good idea to be able to push longer in let's say the zone two, right? And pushing those 260 watts at zone two instead of 180 watts at zone two, because at the end,
exactly.
uh, there are going to be some workouts where you have to use ergs, right? Like very
Yeah.
specific ergs, 30 calories for time or something within a workout. And if you can just, yeah, not accumulate that much lactate at a higher
Yeah,
wattage, I do think it might be beneficial. But yeah, who knows? I
exactly.
mean, they show some incredible athletic feats. So yeah, it's
Yeah,
difficult
exactly.
to comment, but quite interesting. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, super interesting this zone two stuff because yeah, there's been a lot of talking about this and how you implement this into high intensity athletes is something in the open. I would not be completely sure what to think about it. Maybe one thing I can tell you is that we and also another research group did a study where we just substituted some of the high intensity workouts by zone two training, like on the ergs or just lower heart rate
Oh,
in
interesting.
CrossFit athletes, 6 weeks, 8 weeks training. And we saw the exact same, let's say, performance increases. So after 6 weeks or 8 weeks of structured training, obviously you will see 8 to 10% improvement in CrossFit specific workouts, but also strength and so on. And we didn't see a detriment overall, right? And they did actually train quite like specifically zone two or low intensity, probably not zone two. So I mean, that's pretty useful for maybe for athletes to understand, right? Like I don't have to go always all out to have the benefits. I can just also work on movement
Yeah.
efficiency and
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 I
so
think
on.
there's a lot of value in that too, because you just think of something that I always think about is the different fatigue or recovery cost
Yeah,
of these different types of workouts. And I think one of the valuable aspects of like the lower intensity zone two stuff is it really is easier to accumulate volume there
yeah,
without accumulating a ton of fatigue or musculoskeletal damage. And that allows you to be consistent over
yeah,
time. And it probably allows you to have a pretty psychologically beneficial relationship with exercise too. So I've noticed for a lot of athletes, like
yeah.
just by tuning down the intensity, sometimes those who want to be higher volume, it allows them to be more consistent over time because there's less fatigue and psychologically it just puts less wear and tear on them.
Yeah. Yeah, I always say this as well. I think it makes complete sense, and something that is kind of a mind shift, certainly in the CrossFit mind or in the high intensity mind. But for sure,
Yeah.
it's good that you echo this because it's an important. Maybe one of the key messages of this podcast would be this actually that you just have to enjoy also training and don't have to
Yeah, I
kill
think
yourself every time.
enjoyment. And I think that's important because one of the main stimulus that I think is very critical, especially from an endurance standpoint,
Yeah,
is just consistent training months after months, years after years. And to do that, you have to enjoy it and you have to make sure your body can recover and adapt. Because I mean, there's a reason like elite marathon runners, elite CrossFitters, at least HYROX athletes are training so many hours per week.
yeah,
Like they need the volume. If not, they all wouldn't be doing it. Like that's the one variable that it seems like most of them do have in common that in all these sports, they're training with extremely high volume and a number of hours per week. And they do have intensity too, well-structured intensity, but that volume just seems to be key.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is. I mean, there's good research about this. Like even in weightlifters, total weight lifted over the whole
Yeah.
year is like correlated to performance, which is a pretty crazy stat if you ask me.
Yeah.
But
No, of
interesting
course.
though. Yeah, and the same with marathon runners and so on. I mean, that's for sure. That's for sure true. Um, yeah. So switching towards, I mean, so endurance sport. So let's say a typical, let's say athlete comes to you and wants to improve their marathon time. They can run already. They're above this way, this not able to go into the zone two training. They're actually good runners, but they want to get 10% on top of their or off their marathon time. How would you tackle such an athlete? Just training wise, I would say.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So you're referring to, just so I'm clarify, like a marathon runner, like a
Let's say
pretty.
a 3 hour marathon. So he can run or she can run, but wants to go for 2:45, something like this. So hi guys, sorry to interrupt the video, but I want to give you a quick heads up about the seminar weekend that I will be organizing in Frankfurt from March 7th to March 9th. With a blend of hands-on workshops and theoretical lectures, we will really deep dive into the physiology of functional fitness. For example, you will learn how to test functional athletes using lactate as well as NURS and how to apply that data into your programming. We'll talk a lot about different styles of programming, how to train using different exercise intensities, as well as an introduction to the newest wearables and, let's say, new nutritional protocols that you can use to enhance your performance. It is really for athletes, coaches, or people who are interested in functional fitness and fitness overall and want to learn more than what you usually read on social media. It is going to be exclusive. We only have 22 spots available, so you'll have to be fast to secure your spot. If you want to have more information and also the detailed program overview, just click the first link in the description or check the QR code that is popping up on the screen. Cool. Hope to all see you next month in Frankfurt. And now let's go back to the video.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the main ways we approach the training from that, I think those three things that come to mind, or a
Yeah.
few things that come to mind. Number one is kind of the point we just brought up, where consistent training over time for the marathon is
Yeah.
by far the most important variable. If we can accumulate, like you look at some of the new literature that's coming out, the thing that separates some of the fastest runners are it's just volume and that they're accumulating more miles throughout the week and over time. So my first question would be, what is their weekly training
Yeah.
volume? How could we potentially increase that in a way that is going to be safe and also help them? And
Yeah.
so just like anything, when we're increasing training load, we don't want to increase too much too soon. So we look at, okay, what's a great way to potentially increase this individual's training load, a responsible way to slowly build up over time? So that's number one is how can we increase their training volume in a way that's going to be safe?
Yeah.
Number two is what do we see like in a weekly or in a microcycle structure? One of the big issues I've seen when I've worked with a lot of these marathon runners is that there's not actually a lot of variability in what the day-to-day structure looks like. Every run is kind of similar, where it's like kind of hard, kind of not hard. It's kind of like in this like weird place where like they're not actually having like underlying periodization in their microcycle. So number two is we want to lay out a clear microcycle where they have very easy run days and then they have key quality sessions. So we
Yeah.
typically have 2 or 3 quality days
Yeah.
in a week, usually two for most of them. And the goal on those quality days to make sure we accumulate intensity and intensity that is going to prepare them for the marathon. But then we have a few days after that where they can recover through easier runs. So
Yeah.
a framework I really like to live by for these marathon runners is keep the hard days hard and the easy days easy. So essentially what that means is on the hard days, we typically have high quality sessions. So those could be track sessions, tempo
Yeah.
runs, or like marathon specific workouts. Just any kind of run that's typically faster than an easy run.
Yeah.
And on those days, we'll do that. And then if they are going to lift as part of the program, which a lot of them do, we
Mm-hmm.
typically would do our lower body lifting on that day, but later in the day too, because
Okay.
that also is
That's a hard day.
muscular stress. Yeah, with like higher eccentric stress, so it leads to higher muscle damage. And so we like keeping those hard days hard because then let's say that's on a Wednesday, that will have two just easy days of
Yeah.
running, particularly Thursday, Friday, before they have another hard day. So then their
Yeah.
neuromuscular or musculoskeletal system have plenty of times to recover. So number two would just make sure that there's a good structure in the microcycle.
Yeah.
And number three, where I've seen a lot of them go wrong is preparing for the specific demands of the race. So a marathon's an interesting event where it does occur in that gray zone or it occurs between those two thresholds, right?
Yeah.
You're gonna run it above your first threshold. It's not gonna be zone two, but you're not gonna run it at your threshold because you typically hold a threshold for like an hour, 50 to 70
Yeah.
minutes, depending on the individual. So it's gonna be like for a 3 hour marathon below that. It's gonna be in between those two.
Hmm.
But the biggest mistake I've seen is leading up to a marathon, a lot of these like 3 hour marathons or some who are a little slower, they'll do a ton of easy running in that zone two, and they'll do a ton of really fast running above the threshold.
Hmm.
Maybe that's like zone four, so zone five on the track. But you and I know that from an exercise physiology standpoint, one of the most important variables is exposing the body to the specific demands of the event. Especially as we get close to the event, we want to go general to specific. So the
Yeah.
third point I always like to make is that as we get close to the race in a specific block, let's say we're like 10 weeks out, as we enter
Hmm.
a specific phase, we want to make sure we're doing a ton of marathon specific work. So, for example, a progression would be like maybe on the weekend long run, we do 2 mile repeats at marathon pace with 1 mile rest. And then we work that up to 3 miles at marathon, 4 miles. We just try to start increasing the intervals where they're working at a marathon pace so their body's exposed to that specific demand of running at a marathon effort for long durations, which they will do on race day, and just teaching the body to stay there. So I'd
Yeah.
say from a training perspective, those are the main things.
Yeah.
We want to make sure there's an overall plan where we go general to specific as we get close to the race. We want to make sure we're doing a lot of marathon specific work so their body's used to being exposed to those demands. I ask, how can we increase these individuals' training volume? Because we know volume is important without hurting them. So responsibly progressive training load. And just make sure there's some kind of underlying structure in the microcycle where we have some like easy, high quality days, but then time to recover between those days too.
Yeah, yeah. Makes complete sense. Very very interesting, obviously. Um, yeah, there's a lot of people nowadays in the in stepping into the HYROX world, right? And I think also
Yeah.
for maybe for your business even, or at least for people that are interested in endurance training, this is really like opening up a whole new can of worms. Because there's a lot of CrossFit athletes who like CrossFit, obviously, but they also want to do something else and maybe just get into the endurance world a bit more.
Yep.
So, would you, so let's say you're, we talked about this, like a high intensity athlete, right? Like someone who really likes to go hard, is pretty strong, can lift good weights, but wants to, let's say 6 months out, wants to get into some kind of a high rocks race at a decent competitive level, obviously, because that's how CrossFitters are. Let's mostly. Um, how would you attack the running volume? Because that's something I really struggle with myself. That you typically they're pretty big athletes, not
Yeah.
used to running, and Hyrox is really very running heavy.
I
Uh,
was gonna say, I feel
yeah, yeah.
like
So that's also why, by the way, and that's one of the things that I always said in my videos is that CrossFit and HYROX are really different. I mean, sport, whatever modalities, they're completely different from an exercise
yeah,
physiology point of view. Obviously, HYROX derive their workouts from CrossFit, but doesn't mean that the stimulus is the same, right? Certainly not. So that's something that people have to understand. It's not because you're good at CrossFit that you're going to be good at HYROX. Certainly
yeah,
not. But you wanna get into the groove of running a bit more. How would you attack this? Let's say, how would you get to the right mileage? How would you get to the right um, pacing as well? I guess that's also pretty important for such an
yeah.
athlete. Just, I mean, obviously pretty broad. You don't have to go super
No, no,
specific here.
yeah. I mean, I think you brought up a great point. HYROX, I think, is actually very much a running sport.
Yeah,
Best HYROX athletes I've worked with have a large background in endurance
yeah,
running,
yeah.
specifically like higher intensity endurance running. So the framework I would approach to a HYROX athlete is similar to what I would do to a marathon. It's actually very similar to what I would look at for like a 5K or 10K athlete is
Yeah.
the event that I think is very similar from a running standpoint. And so I think if we look at underlying endurance, like physiology, that really matters for high rocks. I think you do need to have an aerobic base to recover between all those events, and you are working out for like an hour. But I also think the variable that's probably the most important is that second threshold or that metabolic steady state, because you're doing those 10K, you're doing those K repeats, you're running at a high intensity. So from a running standpoint, from a high rocks athlete, I would go with that general to specific approach. Where early on, away from the high rocks, we're going to work on underlying running qualities that we think support specific high rocks work, which for me would be that second threshold. So early on in the off season at HYROX, we do a lot of training, so easy miles to develop the aerobic base, and then also a lot of very like not very intense, but sprint based work or hill work to develop their maximum speed. So we take an approach maximal speed and very easy aerobic based work. And I think developing that maximal speed, raising the maximal sprint speed, kind of just helps raise the ceiling from a neuromuscular
Yeah.
standpoint. So then the threshold is a smaller percentage of that. And then as we get closer to the race, we still will keep that aerobic base, but we work up our mileage early on. So we get to like whatever we think the important mileage is, like 30 to 40 miles a week for that athlete early in the prep phase, and we do a lot of speed work. And then as we get closer to the race, we'll definitely drop the volume of speed work and probably slightly drop the volume of the aerobic easy runs. And for our intense days, the key sessions will probably be a lot look a lot more like the event. So like threshold sessions, for example, K repeats, which are similar to high rocks,
Yeah.
or the threshold work. So again, it's probably just like the same underlying principles where we go general to specific, but the specificity is probably a little more higher intensity work rather than a marathon.
Yeah.
And we definitely put an emphasis on like sprint speed, I think is important for them, raising the roof on their neuromuscular abilities.
If you want to try these principles yourself, on February 17th, we are launching our fully fledged HYROX programming. We have two kind of tracks. One would be, as we just discussed, for CrossFit athletes, strength athletes who want to jump into HYROX and need to improve their running. And one would be more for endurance athletes who are obviously already well equipped with endurance, but need to improve their speed and power at the stations. So if you're interested in trying this out, we have a 2-week free trial running right now. You can find all the info in the link in the description. And do you think that, just from a physiological point of view, could you also add to that general to specific, let's say, principle
Yeah.
using functional movements? Because what I sometimes program for CrossFit athletes is kind of threshold training with functional movements. Usually in CrossFit,
Yeah.
it's going all out, breathing on the floor after a workout. But you can, if you know the athlete and you know the rep schemes, you can actually work at threshold for 4 times 5 minutes, something like this, right?
Yeah.
Um, and likewise, you can also very easily do kind of sprinty work in an HYROX athlete, whatever, sled sprints or something. Do you think that that would also be a good add-on next to the running per se? Or how do you see that?
Yeah, though I view it very similar to you, and I would imagine this is how you view it too. Well, like that still is a cardiovascular. Still no stimulus that could be like an endurance aerobic cardiovascular stimulus. Some of those movements, I would definitely add those in because I do think practicing those specific skills
Yeah,
is important for the
yeah.
event because there's that motor control element
Oh, yeah.
where you like from a cardiovascular like stroke volume, even just like how your body's distributing blood flow throughout the body like the way your muscles are recruited is going to have a large effect on like the way blood flow is distributed. Like we know that's going to affect the VO2. So I do think practicing those skills in an endurance standpoint too is really important. I mean, what's your opinion on that? You agree?
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. And I do think that people like to follow too much the Instagram workouts where they do some kind of long HYROX workout, 5 rounds for time of running, kettlebell, whatever, deadlifts, farmer carry, and something like this, where it's kind of a long training that is in between that no zone, like not above the threshold, slightly below probably threshold. But there's no really a specific goal of that training, right? Um, it yeah, and that's something I do think that people sometimes do too much of. It's better to work with a specific focus running or within the functional movements where you can do very high intensity work with sufficient amount of reps using functional
Yeah.
movements that are also included in HYROX. It doesn't have to be a 50-minute grind where you're completely exhausted afterwards,
Yeah.
because I mean those workouts are actually pretty hard, right? That's something I sometimes think, like, okay, people can think about their stimulus a bit better, instead of just going a long kind of CrossFit workout that is just HYROX.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a really good point. And I think like what you said earlier, where you think about like some of the threshold workouts I prescribe my athletes now. Like you said, like the 4 by 5 minutes, like if you want to do an all-out threshold, like you theoretically could do 2 by 20, 2 by 30 minute thresholds, which are going to be
Yeah,
terrible, right? But that's a
yeah,
huge stress. But
yeah,
we potentially, by breaking it up, kind of like you did, like you said, or just doing some reduced volume, we can still get a bit of that stimulus and focus on the quality of the session without like destroying you for the next few
yeah,
days.
yeah, yeah. I think it's also what the Norwegians always say, right?
Yeah,
Like
it's
try
like
to
the classic
get into
Norwegian.
the yeah. But I love that concept. It's very important, and they understand obviously that volume is important and that you
Yeah,
obviously also need intensity, but maybe not too much. You just need to be able to
exactly.
go
Like
again the next
why?
day.
Exactly. The whole thing is like intensity control, right? We're like reducing the volume above the second threshold or doing more of that middle zone. And the whole thing is, from my understanding, is by having that intensity control, you're going to be able to accumulate more volume and come back every day and accumulate more high quality
Yeah,
volume. And I
yeah,
agree from working with the athletes and in my own training, I've personally noticed that most individuals respond better to that.
yeah,
Just from being able to accumulate more high quality volume throughout the week by slightly reducing the intensity or controlling the intensity.
yeah, yeah. Makes complete sense. You said that you worked quite a lot with technology wearables. Could you
Yeah.
elaborate a little bit on that? Which ones are you interested in? Which one do you think are
Yeah,
useful?
yeah. I mean, it's mostly just for me a good way to potentially quantify
Yeah.
training load in a more objective fashion.
Hmm.
So I'll give you an example. Like the technology I utilize mostly with my athletes is initial assessments would do things like force plates. And we'll do force plates to understand like force output, power, speed generation, and potentially get an idea of their underlying neuromuscular qualities relative to elites in their field from a pure like biomechanical and neuromuscular standpoint. And then for some individuals who are like at that 99th percentile, we'll do longer duration threshold testing so we get a good idea of their training zones and running economies.
Yeah.
And then VO2 max. So we can see where thresholds sit relative to VO2 max. That test is interesting to me because if someone's threshold is all the way at like 95% of
Yeah.
their VO2 max, then you're kind of at your aerobic ceiling already. So you may need to focus on moving the VO2 max up.
That's a good
So it
point.
may help you be a little more specific with the intervention in the training. And then from an actual monitoring standpoint, right now, honestly, I do a lot with like GPS. I mean, just GPS to understand load over time. You get a training stress score and heart rate too, and typically a strap or an armband just to make sure the heart rate's a little more
Yeah,
accurate.
that's
That
always
way we
that's
can
always important.
potentially yeah, potentially compare like the external running versus the internal heart rate load, but also take it with a grain of salt because, environmental conditions like hydration status, a lot of things affect heart rate.
Yeah.
But it is good just to potentially have over time and compare that. That's most of it. I'll do a little bit things with accelerometer and shoe pods. I'm still not sold on them. I think GPS honestly can be just as good right now.
Yeah.
Um, but that's a lot of it. And then if people are potentially interested in sleep data, HRV, we'll track some of that too. But again, for me, the main variables are like some form of training, stress, understanding the training load, and just making sure that's consistent over time. And then potentially some internal load marker where it's like heart rate or even RPE. I'm still a huge fan of RPE to understand perceptually what they felt.
Yeah, yeah, it's so important. RP is so good. We use this a lot in our training programs for yeah, understanding the training load because certainly, for example, for CrossFit, even HYROX, it's really hard to know exactly what the training did to the body because I do believe, I mean, it's hard to put into numbers that a 10-minute high intensity workout using burpees and thrusters at heart rate 170 is like it feels almost um, you will need to recover almost more from this than doing the same thing on the bike, just only
Oh,
monostructural.
100%.
Although the heart rate was the same, right? Like,
Yeah.
and there's something towards this addition of functional movements that makes it just yeah, like hard to recover from.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
agree too. I've found
absolutely.
something too, like with that, like the bike and like when we do cross training with the athletes, they just recover so much faster than if we actually do like functional movements or running itself, where there's
Yeah, yeah,
obviously just such a large muscle mass recruited throughout the body, and then you're dealing with like impact forces, the
yeah.
eccentric
That's
forces
the
from the
point.
ground, I think play a huge role.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have you been looking into NIRS, like near infrared spectroscopy, because you have good
I've done
wearables
some
now?
stuff with Train Red. Yeah, I think Neos is interesting. There's just a lot to consider, I've realized from the data standpoint, like how much fat tissue is underneath the device, the
Certainly.
consistency in it. But I have seen pretty good signal in regards to like the desaturation and potentially thresholds from that standpoint. I think
Yeah.
it's interesting. I think as the technology develops and we understand how to make it consistent, I think it could be very interesting. What
Yeah,
about your
yeah,
experience?
this is one of the classic examples of yeah, it's an interesting thing. highly interesting for educational purposes. For example, for my YouTube channel, it's really cool to
Yeah,
show stuff. Um, but what an athlete actually can do with the data is still somewhere in the middle. I mean, the most
exactly.
interesting, in my opinion, it's I even teach a class about this, so I do deep dive quite a lot of it. Um, is still in the endurance world. I think non-invasive threshold assessment in some athletes can be possible, even though it's not 100% accurate, not as accurate as lactate or ventilation.
Exactly.
But it is very easy to do, obviously, right? Like you just put it on and you don't need any machine except for this little thing. And now you have in TrainRed these algorithms that kind of, yeah, automatically detect the threshold, which is, I think, quite nice. Um, so yeah, I'm still in between. For CrossFit, it seems to be highly interesting to show, for example, blood distribution. I think also one of the reasons why CrossFit is so hard and also so difficult is, for example, if you do um, a workout with biking straight into handstand push-ups, obviously you pull the blood more in the lower body, and then if you start doing handstand push-ups or even pushing movements, let's say you have less relative blood and you deoxygenate much faster and you fatigue much faster than when you would do the pushes just fresh, right? And you can see this in the nurse data, which is super cool, I think. So maybe in the 99 percentile athlete, like the really top athletes, you could also use this if you have someone who knows a lot about this stuff and really digs into the
Exactly.
data, which is time consuming and it's all not that straightforward, certainly not with athletes. But I think if there is something that you can, as a coach, want to get an edge on and really understand your athlete's physiology if you're working one-to-one with an athlete, I think it is a good,
Exactly.
cool tool to buy. It's pretty cheap and you can just have it forever. So I still think it's
Yeah.
interesting, but it's still more at the point of it's interesting. But
I agree. I think you brought up a really important point. Like if you could get one athlete to wear it consistently and like just collect data and learn, that's valuable in that
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
technology.
yeah, for sure, for sure. Um, let's talk about nutrition a little bit because
Yeah.
before we jumped on, I think one of the cool things about endurance sports and also a little bit your world marathon runners and so on, there you can really like change the outcome of the race with proper nutrition and proper training of nutrition, right? Like nutrition is always important, but for a 7 minute AMRAP in CrossFit, it doesn't really matter that much, right? You always will have enough glycogen. But if we're talking about HYROX or if you talk about marathon running, yeah, it's highly important, right? So, could you talk about some posts you did about different gels that could be useful, or how you see, for example, carbohydrate yeah intake during longer events?
Yeah. I mean, I think you just brought up a great point, right? Like I think if we think about carbohydrate supplementation during or before events, it matters most based on volume and intensity of the event. I'd speak like to say unless it's a run or a high intensity event longer than 90 minutes, like we probably don't really need to worry too much about gels or fueling in the race. I think HYROX too, like I don't know how much you need to worry about fueling during it. Maybe a little carbohydrate or some supplements could help potentially. That research is still a little murky. But
Yeah,
I think like for a HYROX event that's intense for an hour, you definitely potentially want to make sure you just have enough carbohydrates or muscle glycogen on board before the event. But for example, for events like marathons or any events that are 90 minutes or longer running, where we're running at a bit of intensity like a marathon, that's probably where we get to that point where, okay, the onboard muscle glycogen may not be enough to optimize our performance. So we want to think about exogenous carbohydrate intake, just to help support, and that's going to help spare your liver glycogen stores and also potentially provide your muscles with another carbohydrate fuel source which could help with like hypoglycemia, so your blood sugar doesn't crash, and all things that could potentially prevent bonking and just improve your performance time. So when I'm thinking about taking gels for a race, for example, like let's say I'm running a marathon in 3 hours and I'm running at intensity, so longer than 90 minutes, there's a few key characteristics I want to think about for an energy gel supplementation for these longer events. Number one is I prefer gels, and I think the science would back this up, that are fast digesting. What does that mean? We just want gels that are very simple, like the most simple form of carbohydrates, and that are going to be very fast digesting in the stomach. these fast digesting carb sources are going to cause less stomach stress because they probably won't sit in your stomach as long. They'll be easier for you to digest, and because they move through quicker, they potentially can provide energy to your muscle faster. So the fastest digesting form of carbohydrates are just going to be those pure carb forms, simple sugars, right? Like
Hmm.
glucose, maltodextrin, which is just an engineered form of glucose, and that can potentially help with the absorption, and it essentially behaves like glucose in regards to how quickly it raises your blood sugar. So these simple sugars will have high glycemic indexes. They'll get to your blood quickly, to your blood sugar to be delivered to the muscle. So the main things I look for in gels are fast digesting carbs, which would be glucose, maltodextrin, and then that third thing I do look for is fructose. And so this is where we get into another topic. If we're going to start fueling with higher rates of carbohydrates, they typically say like 50 or 60 grams or higher, but it's probably a little more individualized than that now. We know that combining different sources of carbohydrates, or what we call multiple transportable carbohydrates, is going to help with potentially stomach stress and also help get more carbohydrates to your muscle, or just help your body absorb and use more carbs. That's because there's typically two main forms of carbohydrates we'll talk about here. There's a few more, but the two main ones we're going to talk about are glucose and fructose. Glucose is that carbohydrate, the typical carbohydrate you get from like white rice, potatoes, breads, right? But fructose is another form of carbohydrate, and like its name sounds, is the predominant sources of fructose are things like fruit, apple juice, fruit juices, honey, all have fructose in it. And the thing that's cool about those two different types of carbs is they actually get transported and used by different vehicles in your stomach. You can kind of think about these as doorways where when I eat like white rice, which has glucose, mostly glucose, it's going to get absorbed and digested, then moved out of my stomach through one type of transporter or one doorway into the bloodstream. Where fructose, if I eat a lot of drink a lot of apple juice, the fructose from that apple juice actually will use a different doorway or different transported across from my stomach into the blood. And this is beneficial because we see from the research, or we know now that because these carbohydrates use different transporters, we can actually absorb more carbs than ours. So let's say you eat a ton of white rice and the transporter or the door that is used to move the glucose or the white rice into the blood as energy gets filled. If I then have fructose or that apple juice, that doorway still isn't filled. So that allows me to fill that doorway so then I can absorb and use more carbs per hour by using different sources of carbohydrates, glucose and fructose. And that also can help reduce stomach stress we see. So long story short is when I'm going to fuel with more than around 50 or 60 grams per hour, I'm just going to fuel with a lot of carbs per hour during a marathon because we know higher rates during a marathon up to like 60, 70, 80, 90 grams per hour is going to potentially help performance. Using gels that have glucose and fructose is going to allow my body to absorb and use more carbs per hour. So long story short is number one, I'm going to look for simple sugar, fast digesting carbohydrates. So I want my gel's main ingredients to be glucose, maltodextrin, or fructose. And I also want gels that have both glucose and fructose in them. And we typically look for a ratio of glucose to fructose, which we know is optimal. We typically recommend for every 2 grams, there's a few ratios. The main ratio is for every 1 gram of glucose, we want 0.8 grams of fructose, or we can see that 2 grams of glucose to 1 grams of fructose works well too, based on the how many carbs you're taking per hour. And then yeah, in regards to other things I look for in a gel, I probably mostly just want carbs. I don't really want any fats or protein in there because that can all slow down digestion. So the main things I look for are fast digesting carbs, glucose, maltodextrin, fructose. I want a gel that has both glucose and fructose in it in a ratio of 1 glucose to every zero point 0.8 fructose molecules. And lastly, we probably just only want carbohydrates in a gel. And that's what I look for when I take energy gels on races that are longer than 90 minutes to 2 hours.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Makes complete sense. That's something, yeah. And what do you think about, okay, so this is during events, right? Like longer events. Um, I guess what do you recommend of kind of training this because if you just start racing all of a sudden and then you go for whatever 70
Yeah, you're gonna
grams or
get some
80
stomach
grams,
pain.
you're gonna have some problems, right? So would you actually
Yeah.
recommend sometimes taking some carbohydrates during training, for example, specific training or other
Yeah.
types of training? What do you think?
Yeah, there's something very common for distance runners now, or just athletes who use a lot of gels called training the gut.
Yeah,
And what we see as training the gut essentially means that leading up to your major race for like 10, 12, 16 weeks lead up to it, we're going to practice taking these gels or running while also eating or on a full stomach because that helps your body, the expansion of your stomach, having the volume of food or fluid in the stomach helps your body get better at dealing with it
yeah,
essentially. We don't know exactly if it helps with actually like being more efficient at using the carbs for energy. It probably does it, but what it does help is your stomach's tolerance. So by fueling the stomach with all these gels, these carbs, fluid, food, and then running while it's jostling around, it's going to increase your stomach's ability to tolerate it. So I typically recommend to be super practical, at least 10 to 16 weeks of gut training. Where on my long runs or runs that are similar to a marathon, I start building up. So let's say my end goal is to take 90 grams of carbs per hour. The first week, maybe I'll just take 40 grams of carbs per hour in a gel, then 50
yeah.
grams, then 60 grams, and slowly work my way up every few weeks. And then actually the few weeks before the race, I'll take more than 90 grams. I'll go to like 110, 120, just to really overload it. So my stomach gets used to actually taking more carbs than it's going to have to do the race. And if someone wants a really aggressive strategy, then in the months lead up to the race, we can even practice when we're drinking a lot of fluid and eating like whole foods like potatoes, things like that too, just to really overload the stomach so it can really tolerate. I typically don't do that for most people. If I had to just make it a little more practical, I would say try to get to your goal carbohydrate per hour rate for your marathon at least a month before the race and go a little bit above that just so your stomach gets used to it.
Yeah, that's super good advice because I think most people understand that during a marathon or a HYROX race, you probably need some carbohydrates. They probably under fuel, take too little. But very few people, I think, and certainly coming from the functional world, high intensity, for example, CrossFit world, getting into a HYROX will train the gut because it's again like
Exactly.
it's not really necessary. Maybe the elite athletes know that eating in between like in between events in a competition is also something you can train for, but most people don't do many competitions in CrossFit. So getting into like training the gut during your long runs, 2 months, 1 month before HYROX is one of the best things you can do besides obviously building up the running volume. Super good tip that that many people just simply forget and don't do. I reckon. Um, there's more research. Maybe one of the last points I want to touch upon that I don't know much about, and I know you know more about that than me, about creatine, right? Like creatine is more and more into the endurance world, and I also heard some anecdotes from people that they're taking creatine for endurance, like endurance runners. And I was always thinking, like, why? It doesn't make any sense to my conventional wisdom, but maybe you can elaborate on this, on why people should or can take creatine also for endurance events.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And like you said too, like we know number one, and you could address this, like for high intensity events, like creatine is definitely going to help.
Yeah.
And then obviously we can go into all the potential benefits from cognitive, just overall health and longevity benefits. If your goal is muscle mass, hypertrophy, all those things, we know strength, creatine's going to help. There's been some recent evidence or questioning about, well, then could creatine help marathoners or longer duration athletes? I think number one, the thing to clear there is we do not have direct evidence yet that
Okay.
creatine A is going to be make me run a faster marathon. We definitely can't say that. I don't think we have direct evidence. But the way that the papers have been looking into it and the way I like to go about it, it could be indirect evidence to potentially support other adaptations that could help marathon training.
Yeah.
Maybe it may not be direct. And so the few things I like to look at are number one, it definitely helps high intensity interval training, very high intensity sprints, like things like that. So, as part of my marathon program, I have high intensity sessions every now and then, or sprint sessions. Theoretically, creatine could help me perform better during those high intensity sessions, where my goal is to run as fast as I can, sprint, things like that. And if I get a better training stimulus from that, then maybe that could lead to better adaptations, which could help my marathon running, make like my top end speed or the high intensity interval training. Number two, creatine probably does help you from a recovery standpoint from high intensity or muscle damaging exercise. So again, if I'm doing that as part of my marathon plan, maybe I recover better and can accumulate more volume throughout the week. The other interesting things we do see is that creatine with carbohydrates, especially if you're not eating enough carbohydrates just generally in your diet, it may help glycogen resynthesis.
Yeah.
So if I don't consume enough carbohydrates in a day, if I take creatine and carbohydrates together, it may help store more glycogen in the muscle, which we know is the muscle's preferred energy source for longer duration events. That's another interesting one from that standpoint. The other interesting things we potentially could talk about with creatine for distance runners is we talked about the recovery, we talked about the high intensity track sessions, the glycogen. There potentially is because of the hydration effects of creatine, thermoregulate thermoregulatory events.
Yeah.
So if I am running at heat, for example, it could potentially help with the thermoregulatory events. Again, that one's a little more skeptical. And then the last one too is creatine does help from a muscular contraction standpoint, potentially from a muscular efficiency of contraction standpoint. So again, it potentially can just help from a muscular efficiency contraction standpoint. And then strength training, right?
Yeah.
Creatine
Of
definitely is
course.
going to help your strength power adaptations. So part of my marathon plan is I'm spending time in the gym where my goal is to get stronger, to get faster. Maybe creatine's going to help me get better physiological adaptations from the gym, which again might transfer over to marathon running. So it's more that creatine can potentially help some of these other high intensity or strength and power adaptations that we may get in a marathon training plan that we're going after, for example, in the gym or during our track days, that could potentially support just overall marathon training.
Yeah, that was also my point of view, or thinking at least that the indirect effects are most likely there, and also creatine is really something that certainly doesn't harm you, right? The only potential slight harm it could have is a little bit of weight gain, which could be not perfect for a marathon, but I think it's probably neglectable,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it is
The
very
weight.
safe and
Yeah,
cheap, relatively cheap. So
exactly. Yeah, that's
yeah.
my thing too. It's safe, it's cheap. Like, yeah, maybe there is some small weight gain and you could cycle off before your race, but I would argue that any potential benefits are going to outweigh that.
How is the idea on low carb nowadays in the more
Yeah, it's
endurance
definitely still
world?
present. I know you
Is still
saw the
present?
paper.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely is. I would say not. It's definitely not as much. I still get a lot of messages from like marathoners and ultra runners who say no, low carb is going to make you a better fat burner. You have more energy source.
Yeah.
And I would
Yeah.
just they don't have a baseline understanding of physiology where I don't really care. Like you have enough fat storage to run 10 marathons. That's not the point. Like during any kind of intensity, like a marathon intensity, I would argue your main and more efficient source of energy is going to be carbohydrates, just because we know about how much oxygen cost it causes for an ATP generation via carbohydrate. But I would say, obviously, I know you saw that recent paper too.
Yeah.
Regarding like obviously the hypoglycemia, they wore the CGMs and everything. And I think it's interesting. I would just say that for me, it definitely still is present. But for any marathon distance event or shorter, I just think that we're running at a high enough intensity where that carbohydrate is going to be a much more efficient source of energy than fat at the moment. And I would say, like, from my understanding of that paper, I just don't think the exercise intensity was high enough to make any conclusive evidence.
Yeah, yeah, I fully agree on that one. I fully agree. So that basically we're talking about the paper that came out. You can scroll back, I think 5, 6 posts in wod-science. I can maybe link it. Where a very notorious professor,
Yeah,
Timothy Noakes, is a very
that's one
much.
way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's maybe not the correct word in English, but anyway, so he's very much a low carb professor, and yeah, pretty controversial figure. And they did a study where they had trained athletes doing a crossover design where they once ate carbohydrates and once a diet full of carbohydrates and once a low carb diet, and then they let them do a very specific test that is only done in research, and I don't like the test at all, to be honest. It's basically you put a sub-maximal intensity on the bike, I think it was, and then you let
Yeah.
the person bike as long as possible until they literally fall off the bike because of exhaustion, right? Like not CrossFit exhaustion, but just emptiness, like completely done, right? And yeah, in these kind of tests, they always find differences between interventions because, yeah, it's just a very specific test that you obviously never really do. And there they found that, for example, the low carb guys cycled as long as the ones on a carbohydrate diet. But Yeah, we all know that the exercise intensity was pretty low in that case. They were also exercising very long, multiple hours, and yeah, the interesting part obviously is okay, what would happen if you do a 10K time trial or even a marathon just all out, right? Where we know that the carbohydrate oxidation is going to be much higher. So that's something to consider. I mean, it's a good study. At least the setup was really good, and
Yeah. I thought it was an
I do
interesting
think it
study.
shows. I do think it shows again what we talked about, right? That the body does adapt to what it is provided. So if you provided no carbohydrates, it will get better at fat burning, and you will be able to run or exercise at a pretty high level. You can generate a sufficient amount of ATP from pure fat oxidation. But if you, for example, are on the other end of the spectrum, you're a CrossFitter, and for some reason you read on Instagram that carbohydrates are evil, and you start doing low carbohydrates on a CrossFit, let's say, regimen, then it's going to be much more difficult because your body is probably used of consuming carbohydrates, oxidating carbohydrates, and then combining this with high intensity, that is a recipe for disaster. And that's also what we saw, by the way, in many CrossFit athletes, because CrossFit is also pretty notorious for having low carbohydrates, and that carbohydrates are the devil. But yeah, these kind of studies are interesting for sure for, let's say, ultra marathons where the capacity is more important than the actual power production. There you probably will see some good performance on low carbohydrates. So that's I
Exactly.
think
That's most my, I totally agree. Exactly.
it's not. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why there's so much fuss about this. I don't get it. It's also never shown that carbohydrates are detrimental for health if you keep your caloric balance healthy.
Yeah,
There's
that's my
no
that's
evidence,
I think there's
zero.
so much like I thought that's such a good point. Like so many people like say to me, "Oh no, I'm not eating carbs because I'm trying to lose weight in my off season from running." It's just like obviously the insulin, the carbohydrate
Yeah,
insulin
yeah,
model has become popular, but I just don't agree with it. I think like we have much more robust research for like just energy balance model in regards to if you really do want to lose weight, consuming less calories than you're burning is probably the ultimate factor. And carbohydrates, if you're in an energy balance, carbohydrates are perfectly healthy.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely, and certainly when you're doing the things that we're talking about, like endurance sports or high intensity sports, there's absolutely no evidence. Cool. This was
Yeah.
super interesting. Where can you guide people to that want to know more about you or find something
Yeah,
about
I
you
appreciate
on the
that. The
internet?
best way to stay with me with what I'm doing is definitely through my Instagram, which is Rosner Performance, and I can send you the link to link
Yeah, of course.
ROSNER Performance, and then my newsletter where I do a lot more detailed guides about marathon training, how to fuel for marathons, runs, lifting for running, all that good stuff. So very practical. And I'll send you the link to sign up for that too. And everyone who signs up gets a lot of free guides and stuff.
Yeah, that's good. We'll definitely do that because yeah, I think some of the people following will definitely be interested in more endurance sports. How important for you is social media for your business? And how do you tackle this
Oh, it's a good
ever
question. Social media for my business, I've realized is very important. In regards to the fact where I use it as like a funnel, top of funnel.
yeah,
So my main goal of social media is to create engagement to get people onto like my newsletter, because my newsletter is really where I try to drive relationships
yeah.
with individuals and then get them like coaching in ways that I can actually support them. I just found social media not to be the best way to actually support them. We're getting them an email list, then they could get into my community to be a much better option. And in regards to like most of my content is actually driven through AI,
Yeah.
which is probably interesting where I have like AI stuff set up that it analyzes all my historical content, what creates engagement, and then it helps me write like optimized scripts and content.
Yeah. This is something that's always like kind of the balance between yeah, how engaging does my post need to be, and how yeah, scientifically not really correct, but just like scientists like you and me are
How
are,
do you
are
find that
taught,
balance
yeah,
between
how
like
are taught to be
practically
moderate, like just in the middle, like saying no specific hard, like specific words and so on. But it does work really well to, for example, say three mistakes that CrossFitters always make.
exactly
And it's not bad, but it's really something that we are just not taught to do. And it's interesting also for me to learn still by
exactly.
doing
What
this
about
this
you?
stuff.
Is it important for your business?
Yeah, I mean it's important, of course. I mean I started wod-science really out of philanthropy, like I was doing cool experiments and no one was reading the paper, still not, right? Like sports science, who reads this? Some peers, some scientists, but not really the public or athletes or coaches. And then, yeah, then now I start to understand that okay, I have a quite a big audience, and the goal is obviously to also not really use that audience, but also yeah, integrate that audience into some of the studies we do, and therefore I think yeah, social media is very important and also just very good if you do it well. I don't think it needs
Exactly.
to be always negative. To be honest, I learn a lot from YouTube, from Instagram. I think they're very good content creators, and it's not all bad. And I think that people should also understand this. But I think they
Exactly. There's a balance. It's just like how do you teach people what's good versus not good?
yeah yeah exactly.
I think it's
No.
tough.
No, good man. Let's end on that one. I will definitely tell everyone to go to the link in the
I'll send you
descriptions.
the link too
Yeah,
to everything.
yeah, for sure. And then people can go there. Cool. Definitely do this again about similar but other topics.
Yeah, and just let me know anyway, like I can put it in my newsletter or tag you on my Instagram any way I can support. Just let me know.
Okay, okay, I will do that. Thank you, Jonah. See you
Yeah, have
next
a
one.
great day. Bye.
Bye bye.